The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another routine day. At 42 years old, James had served the Royal Guard for nearly 2 decades, standing watch over the most important family in Britain. His weathered hands gripped his rifle with practiced ease, and his steel blue eyes scanned the grounds with the vigilance that had become second nature. James came from a family where military service wasn't just expected, it was a tradition passed down through generations. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and now James carried on the family legacy. The red uniform wasn't just clothing to him. It was a symbol of honor, duty, and unwavering commitment to the crown. Today felt different, though James couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the unusual activity around the palace, or maybe it was the weight of recent personal struggles that seemed to press heavier on his shoulders with each passing day. His wife Sarah had been battling a serious illness for months, and the medical bills were mounting despite his steady military salary. Their teenage daughter Emma was struggling in school, acting out in ways that worried both parents deeply. As James took his position at the east entrance, he noticed young Prince George walking through the garden with his tutor. The 10-year-old prince moved with a curious energy, stopping to examine flowers and asking questions that made his elderly tutor smile. James had watched the prince grow from a toddler into a thoughtful young boy, always observing the world around him with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most children his age. The prince often acknowledged the guards with a polite nod or a small wave, a gesture that never failed to remind James why he chose this profession. Protecting this family, especially the children who represented the future of the monarchy, gave his service deeper meaning. Even on the hardest days, when his personal problems felt overwhelming, seeing the young royals reminded him of something larger than himself. James remembered his first day on duty nearly 20 years ago. He had been nervous, standing straighter than necessary, trying to prove himself worthy of the position. An older guard had pulled him aside during a break and shared some wisdom that stayed with him. "Son, we're not just protecting buildings or ceremonies. We're protecting the living symbol of our nation's history and future. Every day you stand here, you're part of something that connects us to centuries of tradition." Those words had shaped James's entire career. Through political changes, public scandals, and personal challenges, he had maintained his post with unwavering dedication. His fellow guards respected him, his superiors trusted him, and he took pride in being someone the royal family could count on completely. But lately, the weight of his responsibilities felt heavier. Sarah's condition was worsening, and the doctors were recommending an expensive treatment that wasn't covered by their insurance. Emma had been caught skipping school again, and her teacher suggested she might need counseling to deal with her mother's illness. James found himself lying awake at night, calculating expenses and wondering how he could possibly manage everything on his military salary. Despite these worries, James never let his personal problems affect his professional duties. He arrived early, stayed late when needed, and maintained the high standards expected of a royal guard. His uniform was always immaculate, his bearing proud and alert. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the model of military discipline and dedication. As the morning progressed, James noticed Prince George's tutor leading him toward a different part of the garden, closer to where James was stationed. The young prince was asking animated questions about the various plants and trees, his curiosity apparently boundless. The tutor, a kind elderly man named Professor Williams, patiently answered each question while occasionally glancing at his watch. James had always admired how the royal children were being raised. Despite their privileged position, they were taught to be curious, respectful, and aware of the world around them. Prince George in particular showed a maturity that impressed everyone who interacted with him. He was polite to staff members, gentle with animals, and showed genuine interest in learning about different people and places. The prince's education went far beyond traditional academic subjects. He was learning about the responsibilities that would one day be his, the importance of public service, and the need to understand and connect with people from all walks of life. James had overheard conversations where the prince asked thoughtful questions about why some people had more than others, or what it meant to serve your country. As Prince George and his tutor approached, James straightened his posture and focused his attention on the surrounding area, as protocol demanded. He was a silent guardian, present but not intrusive, protective but respectful of the family's privacy. This balance required skill and experience, knowing when to be alert and when to remain invisible. The young prince paused near a particular flower bed, pointing excitedly at something that had caught his attention. Professor Williams nodded approvingly and began explaining what appeared to be a lesson about different types of butterflies. James couldn't help but smile slightly at the prince's enthusiasm, remembering his own daughter at that age, full of questions and wonder about the natural world. Little did James know that this seemingly ordinary morning would soon take an unexpected turn. The routine day he had anticipated was about to become something entirely different, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service. The young prince, with his observant nature and developing sense of justice, was about to make a decision that would ripple through the palace walls and touch the life of a dedicated guard in ways no one could have predicted. The stage was set for an encounter that would test the bonds between protector and protected, between tradition and compassion, between the rigid structures of royal protocol and the simple human need for understanding and kindness. Prince George's sharp eyes had always noticed things that others missed. As he walked through the garden with Professor Williams discussing the life cycle of butterflies, something caught his attention that had nothing to do with their nature lesson. He observed Sergeant Mitchell standing at his post, noting how the guard's usually perfect posture seemed slightly different today. The 10-year-old prince had grown up around the palace guards, and over the years, he had developed an unusual ability to read people's emotions. His mother, the Princess of Wales, had always encouraged him to be observant and empathetic, teaching him that a good leader needs to understand the people around him. She often said that true nobility came not from titles or wealth, but from caring about others and using one's position to help when possible. George noticed that Sergeant Mitchell's hands, usually steady and sure, seemed to tremble slightly when he thought no one was looking. The guard's eyes, typically alert and focused on his surroundings, appeared distant and worried. There were small details that others might miss: the way Mitchell's jaw was clenched, the tension in his shoulders, the fact that he kept glancing at his watch more frequently than usual. Professor Williams continued his explanation about butterfly migration patterns, but George's attention was divided. He had always been taught to respect the guards and understand that they had important jobs protecting his family. But he had also been raised to see them as real people with their own lives, families, and concerns. His parents made sure he understood that everyone who worked at the palace deserved respect and consideration. During a pause in the nature lesson, George asked Professor Williams if they could sit on a nearby bench to observe the butterflies more closely. The elderly tutor, pleased with his student's interest, agreed readily. From this new position, George had a clearer view of Sergeant Mitchell and could observe him more carefully without appearing to stare. What George saw troubled him. The guard, who had always seemed like a pillar of strength and reliability, looked genuinely distressed. George had learned to read facial expressions from his various etiquette and social training sessions, and he recognized the signs of someone carrying a heavy burden. Mitchell's face showed the kind of worry that comes from serious problems, not just everyday concerns. The young prince remembered a conversation he had overheard between his parents a few weeks earlier. They had been discussing the importance of looking after the people who served their family, making sure that staff members felt valued and supported. His father had mentioned that many of the guards and other palace employees sometimes faced financial difficulties or personal challenges, and that the royal family had a responsibility to be aware of such situations. George's natural curiosity and developing sense of justice made him want to understand what was troubling Sergeant Mitchell. He had always liked the guard, who had been kind to him on numerous occasions. When George was younger and sometimes felt overwhelmed by royal protocols, Mitchell had offered reassuring smiles that helped him feel more confident. The guard had even once quietly helped when George had dropped his favorite toy soldier during a formal event, discreetly returning it later without making the young prince feel embarrassed. As Professor Williams continued the lesson, explaining how butterflies could travel thousands of miles during migration, George found himself thinking about people traveling long distances too, not just for migration, but for medical treatment, for opportunities, for help when they needed it most. His young mind was making connections between the natural world and human experiences in ways that impressed even his sophisticated tutors. The prince had recently begun learning about economics and social issues as part of his broader education. His tutors had explained how some families struggled to pay for necessities like healthcare, education, and housing, even when they worked hard and did important jobs. These lessons were designed to help him understand the responsibilities he would one day inherit and the importance of being a monarch who truly understood his people's challenges. George glanced again at Sergeant Mitchell and made a decision that would have surprised many adults. Rather than simply feeling sorry for the guard or forgetting about his observations, the young prince began forming a plan. His parents had always encouraged him to think about how he could use his position to help others, and he sensed that this might be one of those opportunities. The prince's education had included lessons about leadership and decision-making. He had been taught that true leaders don't just observe problems, they take action to solve them. His grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, had often spoken about the importance of service and putting the needs of others before one's own comfort. These lessons had clearly made a deep impression on the thoughtful young boy. Professor Williams noticed that his student seemed distracted and gently asked if George was feeling well. The prince assured him that he was fine, but asked if they could perhaps take a short break from their outdoor lesson. He suggested they might visit the palace library to research more about butterfly migration. But his real intention was to have some time to think about what he had observed and what he might do about it. As they walked back toward the palace, George took one more look at Sergeant Mitchell. The guard stood at attention, fulfilling his duties despite whatever personal struggles he was facing. This dedication and professionalism impressed the young prince even more and strengthened his resolve to find a way to help. George's mind was already working on the problem, considering various approaches and possibilities. He knew he couldn't simply walk up to the guard and ask about his personal life. That would be inappropriate and might even get Mitchell in trouble. But the prince was creative and determined, qualities that had served him well in his studies and would now be put to use for a more important purpose. The wheels were in motion for what would become an extraordinary demonstration of compassion and wisdom from someone who, despite his young age, was already showing the qualities of a true leader. Prince George's next actions would prove that sometimes the most powerful gestures come not from grand proclamations or formal ceremonies, but from quiet observations and thoughtful responses to human need. That evening, Prince George sat in his private study, surrounded by books about leadership and history. But his mind wasn't on his homework. Instead, he kept thinking about Sergeant Mitchell and the worry he had seen in the guard's eyes. The young prince had learned that great leaders throughout history were often remembered not for their grand gestures, but for their kindness to individuals who needed help. George picked up his secure phone and called his private secretary, Mrs. Henderson, a wise woman in her 50s who had worked for the royal family for many years. She had always been patient with his questions and had helped him navigate complex situations. Before, Mrs. Henderson had a talent for explaining adult matters in ways that a 10-year-old could understand while still treating him with the respect due to his position. Mrs. Henderson, George began carefully, I need to ask you about something important. Is it possible for me to learn about the personal circumstances of palace staff members if I'm concerned about their well-being? Mrs. Henderson paused thoughtfully before responding. She had grown accustomed to the young prince's unusual maturity and his genuine concern for others. Your Royal Highness, that's a very thoughtful question. While we must respect everyone's privacy, there are appropriate ways to ensure that staff members receive support when they need it. May I ask what has prompted this inquiry? George explained his observations about Sergeant Mitchell, being careful to express his concerns respectfully. He described how the guard seemed troubled and asked if there might be a way to determine if Mitchell needed assistance. Mrs. Henderson listened carefully, impressed by the prince's empathy and his understanding of appropriate boundaries. I'll make some discreet inquiries, Mrs. Henderson promised. If Sergeant Mitchell is facing difficulties, we can explore appropriate ways to offer support. Your concern for his well-being shows remarkable compassion, Your Royal Highness. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson contacted the head of palace security, Major Thompson, a decorated military officer who had served with distinction for 15 years. She explained that Prince George had noticed one of the guards seemed distressed and wondered if there were any known issues affecting staff morale or personal circumstances. Major Thompson was initially surprised by the inquiry but quickly understood its significance. He had always admired Sergeant Mitchell's dedication and professionalism, and he had indeed noticed some subtle changes in the guard's demeanor recently. As a leader, Thompson believed in taking care of his men, and he decided to have a private conversation with Mitchell. During the lunch break, Major Thompson approached Sergeant Mitchell in the staff dining area. "James," he said, using the guard's first name to signal this was an informal conversation, "I wanted to check in with you. You've been one of our most reliable men for years, and I've noticed you seem a bit strained lately. Is everything all right at home?" Mitchell hesitated, unsure whether to burden his superior with personal problems. But Major Thompson's genuine concern and the weight of his worries finally made him open up. He explained about Sarah's illness, the mounting medical bills, and Emma's struggles at school. He assured the major that his personal problems weren't affecting his work performance, but admitted that the stress was becoming overwhelming. Major Thompson listened with the understanding of someone who had seen good soldiers struggle with circumstances beyond their control. He had served in combat zones where he learned that taking care of his men's families was just as important as any military objective. "James," he said firmly, "you should have come to me sooner. We have resources available for situations exactly like this." Thompson explained that the palace had an employee assistance program that could help with medical expenses and family counseling services. There were also hardship funds available for long-serving employees facing unexpected financial difficulties. Mitchell had been so focused on maintaining his professional standards that he hadn't realized these support systems existed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson reported back to Prince George, explaining that Sergeant Mitchell was indeed facing family challenges, but that appropriate support was being arranged through proper channels. She praised the prince for his observational skills and his compassionate response, noting that his concern had led to help that might not have been offered otherwise. George felt relieved that help was being provided, but his young mind was still working on the situation. He had learned about the importance of personal gestures and individual recognition from his studies of great leaders throughout history. Reading about figures like his great-great-grandmother Queen Victoria and his grandfather King Charles III, he understood that sometimes the most meaningful actions were personal and direct. The prince began researching the proper protocols for acknowledging exceptional service among palace staff. He discovered that there were formal mechanisms for recognizing dedication and long service, but these were typically reserved for special occasions or retirement. George wanted to do something more immediate and personal, something that would directly address Sergeant Mitchell's current situation. That afternoon, George had a conversation with his father about leadership and responsibility. He asked thoughtful questions about when it was appropriate for royals to intervene in personal situations and how to balance formal protocols with human compassion. His father, impressed by his son's maturity, explained that true leadership often meant finding creative ways to help others while respecting established procedures. George's father shared stories about how previous monarchs had quietly helped individuals in need, often through indirect means that preserved everyone's dignity. He explained that the most effective royal interventions were often those that seemed to arise naturally from existing protocols and traditions, rather than appearing to break rules or create special exceptions. These conversations gave George the framework he needed to develop his plan. He began to see how he could use his position and the existing palace systems to make a meaningful difference in Sergeant Mitchell's life. The young prince was learning that true power came not from commanding others, but from finding ways to serve and support those who served others. As George worked on refining his approach, he felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about helping one guard, it was about learning to be the kind of leader his people would need him to be. Every great monarch in history had faced moments when they had to choose between easy adherence to protocol and the harder path of genuine service to others. 3 days later, Prince George put his carefully considered plan into action. He had spent hours researching royal protocols and historical precedents, working with Mrs. Henderson to ensure that his approach would be both meaningful and appropriate. The young prince had learned that the most effective gestures often appeared spontaneous, while actually being thoroughly planned. George requested a meeting with the Lord Chamberlain, the senior official responsible for managing the royal household. This was an unusual request from such a young member of the royal family, but the Lord Chamberlain, Sir William Ashworth, had always been impressed by Prince George's maturity and understood that the boy was being prepared for his future responsibilities. Sir William, George began formally when they met in the ornate office, I would like to discuss the possibility of creating a special recognition for outstanding long-term service among palace staff. I believe it would be valuable to acknowledge individuals who have demonstrated exceptional dedication over many years. Sir William raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this unexpected proposal from the 10-year-old prince. That's a very thoughtful suggestion, Your Royal Highness. Do you have particular criteria in mind for such recognition? George had prepared for this question carefully. I think it should recognize guards and staff members who have served for 15 years or more with exemplary records, particularly those who have maintained their high standards despite facing personal challenges. I believe such dedication deserves formal acknowledgement. The Lord Chamberlain was genuinely impressed by the prince's reasoning. He could see that this wasn't a childish whim, but a carefully considered proposal that reflected real understanding of leadership principles. How would you envision this recognition being presented? I would like to personally present a commendation letter and a monetary award to deserving recipients, George replied. Perhaps we could call it the Prince George Service Excellence Award. I think the personal presentation is important. It shows that their service is valued by the family they protect. Sir, William agreed to research the proposal and consult with other senior officials. Within 2 days, he returned with approval for the prince's initiative. The palace legal team had reviewed the proposal and found it entirely appropriate, particularly since it would be funded from Prince George's personal allowance that he had been saving for charitable purposes. Meanwhile, Major Thompson had been working with the Human Resources Department to identify staff members who met the criteria Prince George had outlined. Sergeant Mitchell's name immediately came to mind. His nearly 20 years of exemplary service, his current personal challenges, and his unwavering professionalism made him an ideal candidate for this new recognition. On Friday morning, Prince George dressed in his formal day attire and met with Sir William in the main drawing room. A small ceremony had been arranged with Major Thompson, Mrs. Henderson, and a few other senior staff members present as witnesses. Sergeant Mitchell had been summoned to the drawing room, though he had no idea why. When Mitchell entered the elegant room, he was surprised to see Prince George standing formally beside a mahogany table where an ornate certificate lay next to a sealed envelope. The guard immediately stood at attention, uncertain about what was happening but maintaining his professional bearing. Sergeant Mitchell, Prince George began, his young voice carrying surprising authority. I have asked you here today to recognize your exceptional service to our family and to the crown. Your dedication over nearly 20 years has been exemplary, and your commitment to duty even during personal difficulties demonstrates the finest qualities of service. Mitchell's eyes widened with surprise and confusion. He had expected perhaps a routine commendation or a scheduling change, not a formal recognition ceremony conducted by the young prince himself. George continued, It is my honor to present you with the first Prince George Service Excellence Award, which recognizes outstanding long-term service and dedication. Your loyalty and professionalism embody the highest standards of the Royal Guard. The prince stepped forward and handed Mitchell the certificate, which was beautifully crafted on official palace stationery with the royal seal. Then he presented the sealed envelope, which contained a substantial monetary award, enough to cover Sarah's medical treatments and provide support for Emma's counseling. Your Royal Highness, Mitchell began, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. This is completely unexpected. Your service speaks for itself, Sergeant, George replied with a smile. Good leaders take care of those who serve them, and good servants deserve to be supported when they face challenges. I hope this recognition helps you understand how much your dedication means to our family. Mitchell opened the envelope and saw the amount inside, more than he had dared to hope for in his darkest moments. Of worry about his family's situation, his hands trembled as he realized that this gesture would solve his immediate financial concerns and allow him to focus on supporting Sarah through her treatment. Your Royal Highness, Mitchell said, struggling to maintain his composure, this generosity, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Thank you seems inadequate. But thank you from the bottom of my heart. George had been coached by his parents about how to handle emotional moments with dignity and grace. Sergeant Mitchell, your service has protected and supported our family for years. It's only right that we support you when you need it. That's what good people do for each other. Major Thompson stepped forward to add his congratulations, genuinely moved by what he had witnessed. He had served in the military for decades and had never seen such a thoughtful gesture from someone so young. Sir William also offered his congratulations, noting that this was exactly the kind of leadership the monarchy needed for the future. As the brief ceremony concluded, Mitchell saluted Prince George with tears in his eyes. The young prince returned the salute with perfect form, having been taught the importance of acknowledging military courtesy with respect and precision. After Mitchell left the room, still somewhat dazed by what had occurred, Mrs. Henderson approached Prince George. Your Royal Highness, what you did today was truly remarkable. You've shown wisdom and compassion that would impress leaders twice your age. George smiled, but his expression remained thoughtful. I learned something important today, Mrs. Henderson. Having the power to help people is meaningless unless you actually use it to make their lives better. That's what real leadership means. Sergeant Mitchell walked back to his quarters in a state of emotional overwhelm that he had never experienced in his military career. The certificate in his hands felt surreal, and the envelope containing the monetary award seemed almost too good to be true. As a man who had spent decades maintaining strict emotional control, he found himself struggling to process what had just occurred. In the privacy of his small apartment within the palace grounds, Mitchell sat heavily in his worn armchair and read the certificate again. The formal language praised his unwavering dedication, exceptional professionalism, and steadfast service during challenging personal circumstances. The last phrase made him realize that somehow, Prince George had known about his family's struggles. Mitchell's mind raced as he tried to understand how the 10-year-old prince had become aware of his situation. He had been so careful to maintain his professional demeanor, never allowing his personal problems to show during duty hours. Yet somehow the observant young royal had noticed his distress and had taken action in a way that was both generous and dignified. The monetary award was exactly what his family needed. Sarah's experimental treatment could now proceed without the crushing financial burden that had been keeping him awake at night. Emma could receive the counseling support she needed to cope with her mother's illness. For the first time in months, Mitchell felt like he could breathe freely. He immediately called Sarah from his secure phone to share the incredible news. When he explained what had happened, his wife was silent for a long moment before beginning to cry tears of relief and gratitude. James, she whispered, I can't believe a child that young could be so thoughtful and caring. This changes everything for our family. That evening, Mitchell struggled with a moral dilemma that had been growing in his mind since the ceremony. The prince's generosity had solved his immediate problems, but it had also created an emotional burden that he hadn't anticipated. How could he continue to serve as just another guard when he felt such profound personal gratitude to the young prince? How could he maintain the professional distance required by his position when he felt deeply indebted to the very person he was supposed to protect? Mitchell had always prided himself on his professionalism and his ability to separate his personal feelings from his duties. Royal guards were trained to be loyal to the institution and the crown, not to develop personal attachments to individual family members. But Prince George's extraordinary kindness had created a connection that transcended normal protocol. Over the next few days, Mitchell found himself watching Prince George with new eyes. He noticed details he had missed before: how the young prince treated all staff members with respect, how he asked thoughtful questions about people's families and interests, how he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the lives of those around him. These observations made Mitchell realize that the award ceremony hadn't been an isolated incident of kindness, but rather a reflection of the prince's developing character. The guard also began to understand something profound about leadership that his military training had never explicitly taught him. True authority didn't come from commanding others or demanding respect. It came from earning loyalty through genuine care and consideration. Prince George, at only 10 years old, was demonstrating leadership qualities that many adults never developed. But this realization also deepened Mitchell's moral conflict. He began to question whether his overwhelming gratitude was compromising his ability to serve objectively. During quiet moments on duty, He found himself thinking more about Prince George's well-being than about general security protocols. He worried that his personal feelings might cloud his professional judgment in a critical situation. Mitchell sought advice from Major Thompson, explaining his concerns in their next private meeting. "Sir," he said carefully, "I'm struggling with how to maintain proper professional boundaries after what Prince George did for my family. I'm concerned that my gratitude might affect my objectivity." Major Thompson nodded thoughtfully. He had anticipated that Mitchell might struggle with this issue, having seen similar situations arise when commanders showed exceptional care for their soldiers. "James, what you're feeling is natural and honorable. The fact that you're concerned about maintaining your professionalism actually proves that you haven't lost it." The major continued. "Prince George's action was intended to support you so that you could continue serving effectively, not to create a conflict of loyalty. The best way to honor his gesture is to continue being the excellent guard you've always been. Your gratitude should motivate you to maintain the highest standards, not to compromise them." This advice helped Mitchell find some peace, but his internal struggle continued. He began to realize that his 20 years of service had been based on duty and tradition, but now he was experiencing something different, a personal connection to the mission that went beyond professional obligation. This new dimension of service felt both more meaningful and more complicated. Meanwhile, Prince George had moved on to other activities and responsibilities, apparently unaware of the emotional turmoil his kindness had created for Sergeant Mitchell. The young prince continued his studies, his public engagements, and his daily routines with the same thoughtful attention he brought to everything he did. But Mitchell's observations of the prince had become more intense and personal. He found himself studying the boy's interactions with other staff members, noting his kindness to gardeners, his patience with younger servants, his respectful attention when older staff members shared stories or advice. Each observation reinforced Mitchell's growing conviction that Prince George was developing into an exceptional leader. This admiration, however, was becoming a source of internal conflict rather than professional satisfaction. Mitchell began to wonder if his intense focus on the prince was appropriate, or if it was becoming something closer to personal devotion than professional duty. He worried that other guards might notice his heightened attention to Prince George and question his motives or his objectivity. The guard found himself at a crossroads that he had never anticipated. In his military career, the very kindness that had solved his family's problems had created a new challenge that threatened to disrupt the professional equilibrium he had maintained for decades. Mitchell was discovering that sometimes the most generous gestures could create the most complex moral dilemmas. 2 weeks after the award ceremony, Sergeant Mitchell's internal conflict reached a breaking point during what should have been a routine afternoon shift. Prince George was scheduled for a photography session in the palace gardens, and Mitchell was assigned to provide security for the event. As he watched the young prince interact with the photographers and palace staff, he found himself experiencing emotions that had no place in a professional security context. Every smile from Prince George reminded Mitchell of the kindness he had received. Every polite interaction the prince had with others reinforced Mitchell's growing admiration for the boy's character. But most troubling of all, Mitchell realized he was no longer just protecting a member of the royal family. He was protecting someone for whom he felt deep personal affection and gratitude. During a brief break in the photography session, Prince George approached Mitchell with his characteristic directness. "Sergeant Mitchell," the prince said quietly, "I hope the recognition has been helpful for your family situation. How is your wife doing with her treatment?" Mitchell was stunned that the prince not only remembered the details of his circumstances, but was following up on them with genuine concern. "She's doing much better, Your Royal Highness, thanks to your generosity. The treatment is proceeding well, and my daughter is also getting the support she needs." Prince George smiled with obvious satisfaction. "I'm very glad to hear that. When people serve our family with such dedication, we want to make sure they're supported when they face challenges. That's what I learned from my parents about being a good leader." This brief exchange, meant to be reassuring, actually intensified Mitchell's internal struggle. The prince's continued concern and his mature understanding of leadership responsibility made Mitchell realize that he was no longer capable of maintaining the emotional distance required for his position. That evening, Mitchell sat in his quarters and wrote a letter that he never intended to send, but which helped him clarify his thoughts. In it, he tried to explain to himself why Prince George's kindness had created such a profound dilemma for him. He wrote about the difference between serving an institution and serving a person you genuinely admired and cared about. As Mitchell wrote, he began to understand that his 20 years of service had been honorable, but somewhat detached. He had served the crown as an abstract concept, protecting the royal family as symbols of national tradition and continuity. But Prince George's personal intervention had transformed this abstract duty into something deeply personal and emotional. The guard realized that he could no longer stand at his post with the cool professionalism that had defined his career. Every decision he made about security protocols was now influenced by his personal feelings for the prince. Every assessment of potential threats was colored by his overwhelming desire to protect someone who had shown him such extraordinary kindness. Mitchell understood that this emotional involvement, while natural and even admirable in human terms, was potentially dangerous in security terms. Guards needed to make objective decisions based on protocols and training, not personal feelings. If a situation arose requiring split-second decisions, his emotional attachment could compromise his judgment or cause him to prioritize Prince George's safety over proper procedures. The next morning, Mitchell requested a private meeting with Major Thompson. When they met in the Major's office, Mitchell's demeanor was serious and formal. "Sir," he began, "I need to discuss my continued assignment to Prince George's security detail." Major Thompson had been expecting this conversation. He had observed Mitchell's increased intensity when guarding the prince and had recognized the signs of someone struggling with competing loyalties. "What's on your mind, James?" Mitchell took a deep breath before speaking. "Sir, Prince George's kindness to my family has created a situation where I don't believe I can maintain the professional objectivity required for my position. My gratitude and admiration for him have become so strong that I'm concerned about my ability to make purely professional security decisions." The Major nodded thoughtfully. "Can you give me a specific example of how this might affect your performance?" "Yesterday, during the photography session, I found myself focusing more on Prince George's personal comfort and happiness than on standard security protocols," Mitchell admitted. "I was watching his interactions with others through the lens of personal affection rather than professional assessment. If a threat situation had developed, I'm not confident I would have responded according to training rather than emotional impulse." Major Thompson appreciated Mitchell's honesty and self-awareness. Many guards would have ignored these concerns or convinced themselves that personal feelings wouldn't affect their professional performance. Mitchell's willingness to recognize and address the problem demonstrated the integrity that had made him such a valuable member of the security team. "What are you proposing, James?" the Major asked. Mitchell had spent hours considering his options. "Sir, I believe I should request a transfer to a different assignment within the palace security structure. Perhaps I could serve in a capacity that doesn't involve direct contact with Prince George, or I could request assignment to other members of the royal family, where I can maintain appropriate professional distance." The Major was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of Mitchell's request. Losing such an experienced guard from Prince George's detail would be unfortunate, but he recognized that Mitchell's self-awareness and ethical concerns actually demonstrated why he had been such an effective guard in the first place. "James," Major Thompson finally said, "your honesty about this situation shows exactly the kind of professional integrity we value in this organization. You're right that emotional involvement can compromise security effectiveness, and your willingness to recognize and address this issue speaks well of your character." Mitchell felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he heard these words. Relief that his concerns were being taken seriously, and that his professionalism was being respected, but sadness at the prospect of ending his service to the prince who had shown him such kindness. "However," the Major continued, "before we finalize any transfer, I'd like you to take some time to consider whether there might be other ways to address this situation. Sometimes the best guards are those who care deeply about their charges, as long as they can channel that caring into enhanced professional performance rather than compromised judgment." Major Thompson's suggestion that Mitchell take time to consider alternatives led to the most difficult week of the sergeant's military career. He found himself questioning not just his current assignment, but his entire understanding of duty, service, and professional loyalty. As he walked the palace grounds during his off-duty hours, Mitchell struggled with the realization that Prince George's kindness had fundamentally changed how he viewed his role. During this period of reflection, Mitchell had an unexpected encounter that would ultimately resolve his dilemma. While walking through the staff quarters late one evening, he overheard a conversation between two younger guards who were discussing their assignments with obvious enthusiasm. "I can't believe how lucky we are to serve Prince George," one of them was saying. "Did you see how he thanked the kitchen staff personally for staying late during the diplomatic dinner? And he actually remembered the name of the new gardener's daughter and asked about her first day at school." The other guard nodded eagerly. "He's going to be an incredible king someday. The way he treats everyone with respect and genuine interest, it makes you want to be the best guard possible. I would do anything to protect someone like that." Mitchell paused in the shadows, struck by what he was hearing. These young guards were expressing exactly the same feelings he had been struggling with, but they were channeling those emotions into professional motivation rather than personal conflict. They were inspired by Prince George's character to excel in their duties, not confused about their professional boundaries. This revelation led Mitchell to seek out Father Mackenzie, the palace chaplain, for guidance. The elderly priest had counseled palace staff for many years and had a reputation for wisdom and understanding. When Mitchell explained his situation, Father Mackenzie listened with the patience of someone who had helped many people navigate complex moral questions. "James," the chaplain said thoughtfully, "you're struggling with a false choice between personal feeling and professional duty. The best service often comes from those who are personally invested in their mission, as long as that investment is properly directed." Father Mackenzie continued, "Prince George's kindness to you wasn't meant to compromise your effectiveness, it was meant to strengthen it. The question isn't whether you care about him personally, but whether that caring enhances or diminishes your ability to protect him professionally." The priest's words helped Mitchell understand that his guilt about feeling personally connected to Prince George had been based on an overly rigid interpretation of professional distance. The prince's gesture of kindness had been intended to support Mitchell's continued service, not to create a conflict that would end it. Over the following days, Mitchell began to reframe his perspective on the situation. Instead of seeing his gratitude and admiration as threats to his professionalism, he started viewing them as motivation to maintain the highest possible standards of service. The young guard's conversation had shown him that personal investment in protecting Prince George could actually enhance rather than compromise professional performance. Mitchell also realized that his concern about objectivity had been somewhat misplaced. His emotional attachment to Prince George wasn't causing him to ignore security protocols or make poor tactical decisions. It was making him more alert, more dedicated, and more committed to excellence in every aspect of his duties. With this new understanding, Mitchell requested another meeting with Major Thompson. When they met, the sergeant's demeanor was noticeably different, more confident and resolved than he had been the previous week. "Sir," Mitchell began, "I've given considerable thought to our last conversation, and I believe I was approaching the situation from the wrong perspective. My personal gratitude to Prince George and my admiration for his character aren't compromising my professional effectiveness. They're enhancing it." Major Thompson smiled, having hoped that Mitchell would reach this conclusion. "Can you explain what changed your thinking?" Mitchell described his conversation with Father Mackenzie and his observations of the younger guards' attitudes. "I realized that the best security comes from guards who are personally invested in their mission, not from those who maintain emotional detachment. My feelings for Prince George make me more vigilant, more dedicated, and more committed to protecting him." The major nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of insight that makes you such a valuable member of this team, James. Personal investment, when properly channeled, creates the kind of loyalty and dedication that can't be taught or mandated." Mitchell continued, "I'd like to withdraw my request for transfer and continue serving on Prince George's security detail. I believe I can now integrate my personal feelings with my professional responsibilities in a way that enhances both." "Request denied," Major Thompson said with a grin. "Because you never formally submitted it in the first place. You were working through a complex situation, and I'm glad you found a resolution that allows you to continue the excellent service you've always provided." As Mitchell prepared to leave the meeting, Major Thompson added one final observation. James, what you've experienced and worked through makes you more valuable, not less. You now understand the difference between mere duty and dedicated service. That understanding will make you an even better guard and will serve as an example to the younger men. That afternoon, Mitchell returned to his post guarding Prince George with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. When the prince approached during a brief break in his schedule and asked how Mitchell was doing, the guard was able to respond with genuine warmth while maintaining perfect professional bearing. I'm doing very well. Your Royal Highness, thank you for asking, Mitchell replied. Your kindness to my family has given me a deeper understanding of what true service means. It's an honor to serve someone who demonstrates such leadership and compassion. Prince George smiled with the wisdom that had impressed so many adults. Sergeant Mitchell, the best leaders take care of their people and the best people serve with both their skills and their hearts. I think we understand each other perfectly. As the prince walked away to resume his activities, Mitchell realized that his crisis of loyalty had actually strengthened both his professional capabilities and his personal commitment to service. Prince George's simple act of kindness had taught both the guard and the future king valuable lessons about the true nature of leadership, loyalty, and mutual respect. Mitchell remained at his post, no longer conflicted but deeply committed, understanding finally that the greatest service came not from emotional detachment, but from the perfect integration of personal dedication and professional excellence.